Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. So, the title of this webinar today is Using Social Data to Transform PR. Now, I think we've got quite a little bit to cover today, but essentially what I'm going to try and talk you through is how you can track your own or your client's reputation, how you can use the social data that's out there to measure your own success, and how you can really evaluate that social data to discover the insights that will help you improve your activity and reach new audiences. So fingers crossed, and looking at the poll results, hopefully that's what you're expecting to hear about. So before I get into it, let me introduce myself quickly. So as Lizzie said, I am Charlia Nelson Rodgers, and I am the EMEA PR Manager for Brandwatch. I work as part of a fairly extensive marketing team here at our Brighton headquarters, and my role is largely making Brandwatch famous, is what I always say. A lot of the work my team does, kind of outside of our business profiling and industry-specific media work, is providing a range of journalists with social data on breaking news and big news stories. So we literally cover everything from the latest celebrity gossip. So I think this week we've done the latest what's happening on Game of Thrones, we've done what Kim Kardashian is up to at the moment, so everything from that level to much more detailed kind of serious stories. So we're doing quite a lot, as you can imagine, on the EU referendum at the moment. So it's a really busy team. In terms of my background, I've been in PR and corporate comms for almost 15 years now, predominantly agency side. I spent 4 years at Weber Shandwick, 5 at Fleischmann Hillard, and have done periods of freelancing kind of for various agencies like Nelson Bostock, like Man Bites Dog. And in my time, I have been mainly in tech and corporate, working for some of the big brands that you'll recognise and some kind of much smaller companies and startups kind of across B2B and B2C. So it's been a varied role for me. And I'm now at Brandwatch, and I've been here for about 18 months. So that's me. So for the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to run through quite a lot, but as Lizzie said, if you do have questions or comments, do feel free to submit them. I know she's monitoring the overall kind of event hashtag, which, as she said, is hashtag Get Digital, but feel free to tweet me directly. I'm on @SharliaBW, the second H, or at Brandwatch, and if I don't get to them during the presentation, I'll pick up with you afterwards. And as Lizzie mentioned, we've also got a couple of poll questions, but they're very quick ones, so have your voting fingers ready. So just a little bit about Brandwatch. For those of you who don't know who we are and what we do, we are a social intelligence company. So we were named a leader in this year's Forrester Wave report for enterprise social listening platforms. But essentially our technology gathers millions of conversations every day, and our customers use our technology to analyse that data, to extract the insights that are really relevant for their business and help them make data-driven decisions. We launched in 2007, so we're still relatively new. I think we are still often described as a startup, but we've now got 350 staff, so I'm not sure how accurate that is. We're a global business, as it says. We've got offices, our headquarters in Brighton, and then we've got offices in Germany, the US, and in the Far East now as well. And we've got more than 1,200 clients, and I think it's now just north of 30% of the Fortune 100 that we work with. So that includes brands like Cisco, Sony Music, British Airways, and the other logos you can see. So that's us. Now, quickly running through what we're going to cover today. Like I said, I'm hoping to stick to around 30 minutes, so we've got time for questions at the end. But we're going to have a look at the value of PR, what that really means, how it's changed, and then I'm going to talk you through a framework for measurement. Now, hopefully this is something you can apply across different businesses and different sectors, but basically looking at what things you need to measure to really demonstrate the value of the work that you're doing. And then we'll look at how you can use social data to track reputation, as well as how you can use it for crises and issues management as well. And then hopefully before we run out of time, I'll talk to you a little bit about how you can measure the impact your activity has on influencing opinion and influencing behaviour, and then we'll run through a bit of a case study. So before we dive right in, we'll start with an easy question. Lizzie, would you mind bringing up the first poll? Oh, there it is. So are you currently using a social listening platform for PR? All you need to do is click on the answer that's relevant for you. I know we've got quite a few agencies and brands who use Brandwatch or social listening, kind of listening today, but I know a lot of companies only use it for kind of one area or another. It'll be interesting to see how many of you are actually using it for PR. Ah, that's interesting. That's really interesting. Now, I'm not surprised actually that kind of maybe 20% are using social listening, but not for PR. We often find that social listening is used in one or two departments, and then once the results of that are seen and kind of how well it goes, it often then gets spread to others. And the use case for PR can sometimes be a bit difficult to see because people are so entrenched in the way that we do things. So let's get into it. So PR is one of those practices where probably over the last 10 years, over the last 15 years, at least as long as I've been doing it, everything's changed and nothing has changed. So I'm sure this isn't the first presentation where you've heard someone talk about how technology, new communications methods, a declining print media industry, they've all impacted what we do. And I have seen it described as a revolution in the tactics of PR. I don't know how accurate that is, but when you think about that and how many agencies now have kind of a real understanding of the peso model, maybe it's not such a stretch. But at least from a media perspective, there's a much greater interplay between paid, earned, shared and owned, that peso model. And the interplay of that content has made it a much more complex landscape than we were working in before. But that said, like I say, the fundamentals are the same. Telling the right story to the right person at the right time is still at the core of what we do. And proving that elusive ROI is still one of the biggest challenges that we face as an industry. So old school PR was really bad at showcasing success. I know it's something that I've always struggled with clients in terms of being able to show them things that are strategically relevant to the business, show them how PR adds that value. And now that AVE, with its tombstone, has been pretty much banished, we do have a real opportunity to bring in a new wave of measurement that really does help us show the value of what we do. And as PR people, I think we understand that everything an organisation does, its employees, its customers, any stakeholders, anything they do or say across any channel has real implications for its reputation. And while it's difficult to assign a pound or dollar value to that reputation, it does have a value. And that's not usually defined by the number of press clippings you got this month or how many spokesperson interviews you've secured in the last quarter. But I don't think that's news to most people in PR. The Barcelona principles have been around for a while now. I think they were introduced initially about 5 years ago, and the last set of updates gave us kind of really clear guidance on how to measure value in PR. And while it's less tangible, that link to business performance, the fact that business leaders really understand that a good reputation results in better business is really important. And business leaders really do want to understand the reasons why there are positive and negative changes to their reputation. It's a key part of the information that they're after. So you're probably thinking, yes, Shalia, all very well. How do we actually do it? And, what am I supposed to be measuring to give me and my business leadership an accurate understanding of the value of the work that I do? And like I say, PR ROI has always been a difficult thing to prove, but social intelligence really does give us a way to measure the success of PR activity. So advertising equivalency, how much it would have cost you to get that piece of coverage had you paid for it as an advert, was popular because it delivered a number. It gave you that pound or dollar figure that you could track and you could see it rising and falling over time. And that was really important. And while we've moved on from that pound or dollar value, social data does give you the same quantitative result. It gives you something, a figure to track over time, but as part of something more meaningful, a much wider evaluation. So it can tell you which publications ran your campaign. It can tell you how widely those stories were talked about. But importantly, it can also tell you who was involved in the conversation and how behaviour changed as a result of your work. So, in terms of a framework, we'll start with what we call the 3 O's. And we really see this as a starting point for any measurement framework to understand the difference between output, outtake, and outcome measures. So I'll look at each one separately so you understand what I mean by each of them. So the output. So this is probably something that most PR people are already familiar with. It's the stuff that's in your weekly reports, it's in your kind of monthly recap. Essentially, it's the measure of what the organisation is doing, what it does. So are you sending out 4 press releases? If you created a customer video, is your spokesperson presenting at an event? You know, those kind of things, the blog posts, the quotes you submit to features editors, the interviews. So the outputs are essentially the things that you are putting out there. And then the outtakes. So this is starting to move us towards a reputational measure. It looks at how people think differently about your brand, about your company, after they've been exposed to your PR activity. So it's often measured by associating the brand with particular attributes. So, for example, when you think of Volvo, you perhaps think of reliability, or Samsung, you think of innovative. So it can also be measured outside of those key attributes by sentiment. So, you know, people feeling positive or negative about your brand. And it will help you identify things like tweet mentions where someone says, customer service at my bank used to be really good, now it's awful. Or they've taken on more staff at my coffee shop and it's so much quicker now, that's great. And it helps you kind of track whether you're getting closer to or further away from the attributes that you really want to be associated with. And it's a step towards the information that is interesting to your leadership or to the board or whoever's monitoring that for value. And then outcomes. So this is the stuff that really that the business leadership want to know about. It's a measure in the change of activity, a change in behaviour of your audience after they've been exposed to your PR activity, whatever that may be. So it can be short-term things like attending a webinar, going to an event, maybe even buying a product. But it also refers to those longer-term changes in behaviour. You know, not everyone is selling a product. There are awareness campaigns and those kind of things. And this measuring outcomes really helps you track things like, you know, are more people giving up smoking? Is using public transport more often, you know, a behavioural change that's resulted from your campaign. Now, within each of these measures, within each of the 3 O's, there are a whole range of individual metrics that you can track. We've talked about a couple of them. And those that will be most meaningful for your business are the ones that tie to your business objectives. So you'll find that any company probably has a range of objectives and a range of audiences at any one time. So they're likely to also have a number of PR tracking dashboards as well. So before we move on, let's have a look at some of the quick wins. We'll have a look at the poll. So thank you, Lizzie. So what are some of the other ways that you're using or planning to use social listening? I think quite a few were saying you're just here for information gathering. So let's see, these are probably some of the most common use cases we have in a marketing kind of setting. So we've got campaign measurement, influencer marketing, reputational crisis management, market research, and lead generation, so new business. I think we find that a lot of our clients use our platform for customer service monitoring or even for product development, but once they see the results there, they realise how the potential for using social listening can help with these other areas. Now that's interesting. Market research is actually a good one. Be interested to know, perhaps you guys can get in touch afterwards and let me know what you consider your market to be, whether you're looking at a market of press or analysts, or if it is kind of industry research and that kind of thing. And campaign measurement's a really good one. That's kind of one of our most regular use cases. So I think we'll talk a little bit in a few minutes about how social listening can really help with kind of campaign measurement. Like I said, I'm going to have a look at some quick wins, talk a bit about how social monitoring and analytics tools can really improve your tracking right away, kind of almost from today. So not that long ago, in almost every PR team, probably still in a lot of PR teams, there was an account assistant or an intern, an office junior somewhere, whose main job it was to get into the office really early, to read all the newspapers, to read all of the print mags that came in, and you probably had an agency doing the same for TV and radio coverage as well when you knew it was coming up. And those people, they do exist because I was one of them, literally spend hours and hours searching for and finding mentions or coverage of their product, the brand, the service, maybe even kind of spokespeople's names, any mentions that impact their business. You know, that those were the results. And if they're really unlucky, like I was, they'll get to do it in 5 or 6 languages, many of which they don't speak, in obscure magazines that they don't really understand. And I know I certainly had to set up lots of Google alerts as well for all of my clients. And more often than not, actually, the alerts came in late, too late to include in my report, or were completely irrelevant to what I was looking for. But I mean, it was something that every team in every agency or every client did. And it was a resource-heavy activity. You know, it took a lot of time, but it was really necessary. But now when you factor in all of the social mentions that are out there as well, it becomes even more costly. And by looking at the volume of coverage and reviewing whether a brand's messages were in there, as well as the type of media the coverage was appearing in, you know, we would create these wonderful reports, often a really lovely coverage book that would sit in someone's reception. And this is where I realised I've chosen some bad stock imagery, because while that man looks very interested in the magazine he's looking at, we know that people very rarely looked at those lovely coverage books, but there was a point to them. And that was not just using 60 billable hours of mine every month, but the point to that report was to provide a snapshot of the company's reputation. Now, those old school reports, you know, perhaps a lot of people are still doing them, the metrics that they included were actually really important and still really relevant. We were looking at a number of things that helped us tell the story of reputation. So volume of coverage was one of those key things, and it was often based on a list of predefined words. So what we would now refer to as keywords, because we're all so savvy. But those would be things like the brand names or the company names, products, spokespeople. You know, in some cases it probably included whatever the key messages were for that organisation as well. And then we'd look at sentiment. You know, it was my job to read each article and try and understand from the tone whether that journalist was feeling positive or negative, or more often than not neutral about my clients. And then in some cases we were able to measure momentum associated with those words and associated with those pieces of coverage. So that was more about understanding the variations, understanding kind of the peaks and troughs and how that volume and sentiment changed over time. And today's dashboards and today's reporting tend to be based on the same areas. You know, the fundamentals are the same, like I said. But the improvements in online monitoring and analytics technology have really improved the PR tracking landscape. And I've pulled out kind of 3 key areas that it's so much better now to kind of talk about. So firstly, that volume of data. The amount of content out there is simply staggering. You know, the days of focusing on your 50 top magazines or even 100 magazines are really over. You know, that story where everyone's a publisher, everyone's a journalist, it's really true. And it means that the data set that we're working with now, the data set that kind of covers your reputation, is absolutely colossal. So it's actually a blessing that speed of automation has advanced so much as well. A lot of what we can monitor can now also be automated. So you don't have to spend hours and hours trawling every single mention to understand what's interesting about those mentions. You can pull the results, you can analyse them, you can cut them however works for you and deliver them in pretty much real time in most cases. Now that can mean that dashboards become complicated, but it also means that PR people and non-PR people can gather the information that gives them the insights they need really quickly. And then the last thing that I want to touch on is that we've now got much better access to really detailed audiences and audience groups. So we've already talked about how anyone, whether it's staff, partners, customers, anyone talking about an organisation can impact its reputation. And those individuals or groups can now be tracked at huge scale. So it's more than just the media, the journalists and the publications that we used to follow. So what those three key kind of areas mean is that you can track your business reputation among specific groups. So whether you want to look at what your employees are saying, specific bloggers, legislators, even people who like your competitor, you can really look at the data within each of those audiences and overlay things like geolocation, sentiment, how influential they are, and it gives you much more opportunity to easily quantify those PR results. And then by analysing the keywords and the sentiment across those different groups, you know, any company can really understand what stories are of interest to which groups. So a good example actually is Skoda. Now, I don't know how many of you will remember Skoda from 15 years ago, but it's a car brand that used to be a joke. You know, it was seen as low value, poor quality. No one really wanted to be associated with it. And a few years back, it was bought out by Volkswagen, and they spent an awful lot of money trying to reposition the brand. So they knew that tracking volume of coverage or tracking volume of mentions didn't really tell them what they needed to know. And what they wanted to know was how the brand's reputation was changing and among which audiences. So they did use social intelligence data. They tracked sentiment towards the brand over time and over scale. And by tracking the momentum of it, it really helped them understand how that brand took the journey from being what was the butt of the joke to being a reasonable quality, semi-professional, kind of private taxi type of car. So it shows how modern methods of tracking PR really help you kind of understand the journey that wasn't possible before. So let's have a look at how to understand what you need to be tracking. You know, most businesses have a pretty good understanding of the issues and the areas they want to track their reputation against. They've probably got a good idea of what their strengths and weaknesses are. They may even have a reasonable understanding of how they stack up against their competitors, where they sit in the marketplace. You know, they might not know exactly, but they'll have a good idea. So let's use these Twitter mentions as an example. So let's say an unnamed insurance company is interested in looking at how different groups of customers think about them in relation to particular themes like value for money or customer service, that kind of thing. Or an energy company. So they might want to install some new infrastructure in a particular area and they want to benchmark their reputation within a particular group of influencers. So maybe local MPs or residents in a particular geographical location, so they can understand how those influencers feel about their brand before they start investing in new infrastructure. Now, both of those companies will probably also want to be seen as an employer of choice. You know, they might want to be seen as providing really good training opportunities for new staff and that kind of thing. The key thing is that as a business, they don't have just one goal or one area of interest. A reputation is based on more than just one thing. So while they'll be monitoring their company name and their brands with, you know, things like value for money and whichever attributes they want to be associated with, they can also set up keywords and searches to track things like graduate recruitment or mentoring programs. And then they can look at those keywords and the sentiment across all of their different groups and audiences so that they get a much better understanding of which topics are interesting to which groups. And then that information can be used to review their comms and target specific stakeholders. So tracking reputation isn't a science. You know, it's not exact. There are all sorts of nuances and variables. Every business has different priorities, has different goals. And the same way that you tailor your comms strategy to the business, you need to tailor your measurement to the comms strategy. So the key is to make the most of the data that you've got available to you. And platforms like Brandwatch and kind of many others on the market gather data from all sorts of sources. So as well as all the news sites and kind of the trade magazine sites that you're probably used to, We also cover things like forums, blogs, and all of the social networks as well. So the amount of data that we're gathering every day is absolutely enormous. And that means that getting insights isn't guaranteed. You know, if you're not looking in the right place and you're not looking at the right people, you're not going to get the intelligence you need or the insights that you're hoping for that will help you measure your value. So that setup time is really important. You know, setting up effective searches, clearly understanding and defining your audience at the start of your project or campaign is time really well spent. Because when you've got data sets so large, it's really easy to skew your results, which makes them meaningless. But the beauty of that is that once that's done, those results are absolutely invaluable. So for reputation specialists, the ability to kind of drill down into that data and look at location, look at sentiment, all of that good stuff, it means they can really understand what's being said about the business, by whom, and how influential each of those individual voices are, so that they can craft their communications, they can craft their marketing or their PR to exactly suit the needs and the motivations of the people they want to speak to. So another good example of that is Peroni. I would hope that as PR people you are familiar with the bottled beer brand. So they advertise all over the country, as you've probably seen. But when they started doing it, they tried to use, well, they did use social data to understand how consumers are responding to those adverts. And the brand as a whole, they paid attention to the kind of language that was being used to describe them. So they looked at the context of the mentions, they looked at how people were talking about them, and they actually really learned something that they didn't know before. And what they understood was that in London, the Peroni brand was considered to be fairly mid-market. You know, it's a mass-produced international beer, not particularly high quality, not especially sought after, just an average product, you know, good brand. But when they looked at the same data for Brighton, and I'm sticking with Brighton because it's where I am, they found that the perception of the Peroni brand was actually very different. In Brighton, it was considered a premium brand. You know, it was considered high quality, this imported beverage that everyone wanted. And it meant that Peroni really understood those kind of regional differences. So they were able to tailor their comms work, they were able to tailor their advertising to suit each of the geographical audiences based on those local perceptions. So being able to segment that huge data set was really valuable in helping them reinforce the reputation of their brand. So issues and crisis, I couldn't really do any presentation about PR without talking about issues and crises stuff. It is kind of an obvious use case for social data, but it's because it's a great example of how social data can transform your PR. Probably one that I think a few of you understand. I think just under a quarter of you selected that in the poll as one of the reasons why you might want to use social intelligence. A lot of our clients use it for crisis and issues management because it helps them spot the issues that have the potential to develop into a crisis. So we talked about tracking those keywords and phrases that you do want to be associated with, but tracking those that you don't want to be associated with can be just as interesting. So it's helpful to break down issues into kind of 3 key areas. So there are some events that will have an impact on your business's reputation that you can be prepared for. You know, they're almost expected, and I think depending on the business type, things like a service reduction due to bad weather or product recalls or kind of data leakages, that kind of thing, they're almost the inevitable things that you know are going to happen at some point. And then there are the smoking or the smouldering issues, and I think these are probably the things that most organisations are aware of. You know, they know what these issues are for them. It could be things like operational weaknesses or technical weaknesses, or sector issues or kind of entire industry issues that they know they're going to have to face at some point. And these are the problems that you know about, but that you hope won't come up. And they're ones that the company usually has a line on, but they're usually more uncomfortable. They're the kind of thing that can flare up really quickly. And then there's the worst kind, the unexpected fires, the ones that you have to drop everything to kind of handle, and these are the ones that can't be predicted. They're the ones that come up out of the blue that there really is no planning for. And for those unexpected fires, as with the others, the single most important thing is knowing about them as quickly as possible. So you need that head start when it comes to handling them, and the extra time gives you that edge when it helps you stop a relatively minor issue, or what starts as a relatively minor issue. Knowing about it sooner can help you stop it from developing or escalating into something much more difficult to manage. So I think most consumer-facing organisations anyway, now find out about issues through social media before they find out about it from, employees or other stakeholders. So a really good kind of example of this is an American brand called Target. I don't know if you're aware of them, but Target is a big US department store. Now, they were stocking a particular dress. It was quite a popular style, available in a range of colours. And one of those colours was called dark heather grey. Now, for some reason, when that dress was made available in plus sizes, the name was changed to manatee grey. Yes, that was manatee grey. Now, that's a decision that was made somewhere in the chain, probably with very little thought, probably with very little realisation of the impact it could have. Now, Target were using social listening and actually spotted the very first mention on Twitter that raised that problem. So they apologised to the customer, they fixed the problem, i.e. they renamed the colour, and they dealt with it. Now, that's still a pretty good, juicy story. So it did get picked up by the press and pretty widely. But in every story that appeared, literally every single one, it was also acknowledged that Target were quick to respond, that they'd apologised, and that they'd already resolved the problem. So you can imagine how different those stories would have been had that not been the case. So it's fair to say planning for a crisis can be uncomfortable. You can't always plan for them. But when you do, and you're using social data, you really need to think about the very worst things that can happen to your business. What are the most likely events that would cause a crisis if they came to light? And it's really important to recognise the difference between crises and issues. Start with the ones that would stop your ability to function as a business, the actual crises, and then you can move to the less serious challenges or the issues. And you need to establish your set of keywords that relate to how those issues would be described online or in social media. So think about the kind of language that would be used. It's never the same language that you put in your Q&A for your execs. Real people don't speak PR speak. Think about the language that's going to be used. And those keywords can kickstart how you track things that could become potential issues and potential crises when you're using monitoring tools. Now, every business has its own way of evaluating how important different types of social mentions are. So whether you use a scoring system or you use a triage setup, whatever way you do it, the key is that you can only evaluate how damaging a mention is once you know it's there. And that's what social listening really helps with. Okay, how are we doing for time? We're doing okay, all right. We have a few minutes, so I have focused a lot on the frameworks, and I've talked a bit about outputs and outtakes, but there's that third O, and that's the outcomes. And this is the bit that kind of really helps you measure your reputation. This is the bit that the board are interested in. This is the bit where we're talking about what people do differently, how they think, what they say, what their behaviour actually is. And we talk about tying this measurement to the business objectives. And that's because different businesses want or need to prompt different types of outcomes. So as I said earlier, whether it's downloading a white paper from your website or going to an event, or those longer term behavioural change, it's about the engagement after being touched by PR activity. And there's lots of ways to track outcomes, and they're both on and offline. So you could, monitor store visits or number of web downloads. Those are quite simple measures, but there are lots of types of activity that could blend social data with other types of data. So whether you use web traffic data or sales analytics data. So I just thought I'd talk you through a case study that kind of is a good example of measuring behaviour change. So this is the one I wanted to look at. It's called the Be Alarmed campaign. You may or may not be familiar with it. It's been running for a few years now, and it was set up by the Energy Trust. So the Energy Trust is kind of a charitable partnership. It's almost a trade organisation that covers the UK's main energy providers. and it also includes a number of charities and other organisations as well. But the idea of the Be Alarmed campaign was to raise awareness and to educate the public about carbon monoxide poisoning. So its goals were pretty ambitious in that it was about behaviour change. It wasn't about downloading a white paper, and it wasn't about buying a specific item. Their aim, the campaign's purpose, was to reduce the number of deaths caused by carbon monoxide. Part of doing that was encouraging people to understand what carbon monoxide poisoning looks like, but also to encourage them to install alarms in their homes. So offline tracking is difficult. Monitoring death records, it's not really possible. And you could look, I guess, at sales data as part of the evaluation for this, but the fact is, carbon monoxide alarms, there's thousands of different types. They're sold in thousands of different types of stores, online. There's just so much opportunity for missing data there. You wouldn't be able to get an accurate sales figure unless you were plugged into every physical outlet and every online store that stocks every type of alarm. So it's just not realistic for this campaign. But one thing that they were able to track, and that was really important to the campaign, was how well they were meeting the goals of educating people and encouraging the use of alarms. So if they could understand how many people were trying to find out more about carbon monoxide poisoning, and if they were trying to find out where to buy alarms or what the best alarm was, then they would be able to see how successful their campaign was. So the Trust used social data and used social intelligence to monitor and understand how well their campaign was going. So they were able to see the volume of coverage or the number of mentions the campaign was delivering. So they were able to look at traditional media, online media, and social. And they weren't limited to a select media list, that top 50 places we want to be seen, but they could track all mentions everywhere. Now that meant they could see the upswing in positive sentiment towards the campaign, but more significantly, they could track a quantifiable change in behaviour based on the number of mentions that expressed a real desire to know more or expressed that they had understood more about carbon monoxide poisoning. And they were able to combine that with search data and were able to identify a spike in searches for carbon monoxide alarms, which ultimately showed them how well the campaign was achieving their goals. So they had a quantifiable measure that they could track over time. They could see which groups of people were being best reached by which tactics, and they could use the social data to refine their messages and adjust their tactics and improve the campaign over time. So it shows that measuring those outcomes, that behaviour change, is possible, and it is possible to still get that quantifiable data to satisfy that wanting to see numbers going up and down. Okay, I think we're nearly there now. I hope you found it useful. I know I've talked a lot. I'll do a quick recap. So we've looked at the value of PR. We've talked about the value of reputation, how difficult it can be to define, and how PR people have really struggled with it in the past. It's a conversation that I've had numerous times with clients and with agencies, and it's a really difficult one to kind of hammer out. But things like the Barcelona principles have given us really good guidance for how to push ourselves to measure value in a way that kind of has meaning for the business overall, which is what's important. And then we talked a bit about how social data and online tracking can be really useful in building these new measurement frameworks, helping you track projects and tracking campaigns and overall reputation over time. So we talked about how value is determined by more than just outputs and outtakes. Campaign success and long-term reputation are built on the outcomes and what people do differently. So I hope that was interesting.